Hello, and welcome to 10 Minutes On, the podcast where we look beyond the headlines to understand the forces that are shaping today's events. The World Cup begins this week, and if you followed the build-up, you could be forgiven for thinking that the story is not about football at all. Instead, it has been dominated by politics, controversy, and questions over what hosting the tournament is actually supposed to achieve. Officially, this is the first World Cup hosted by three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In practice, however, this is overwhelmingly an American tournament. Most matches will take place in the United States, and the latter stages will be staged almost entirely there. That matters because the tournament arrives at a moment when expectations about mega events are already under strain. Visa complications have affected teams and support staff. Immigration policies have generated criticism. FIFA faces scrutiny over ticket pricing, seating allocation, and access. Hotels in several host cities are reporting weaker than expected demand. Even before a ball is kicked, questions are being raised about whether the promised economic windfall will materialize. None of this is unusual. It is increasingly part of the pattern. Because the real question is not whether this World Cup will generate controversy. It is whether hosting a World Cup ever does what its organizers claim. Does it transform economies? Does it generate sustained growth, investment, and jobs? Is it better understood as something else entirely different, though? A temporary intervention wrapped in the language of long-term development? To answer that, it helps to step away from 2026 and look at what hosting has actually produced in the past. Barcelona in 1992 is the most cited case, and for good reason. Before the Olympics, Barcelona was widely described as an aging industrial and port city, struggling to reposition itself. The Games became a centerpiece of a broader urban strategy. Infrastructure was upgraded, the waterfront was rebuilt, transport systems were modernized, the city was reinserted into global circuits of tourism and investment. And the results were real. Tourism expanded significantly over the following decades. International visibility increased dramatically. Barcelona became one of Europe's most recognizable global cities. But the key question is not whether Barcelona changed. It clearly did. The question is whether that change can be attributed to the Olympics alone. And here the answer becomes less straightforward. The Olympics acted as a catalyst for an already existing political and urban project. They accelerated processes that were already underway. They did not invent them. And that distinction matters because it appears repeatedly in other cases. For a more direct comparison for 2026, we may need to look at North America itself. The United States last hosted the World Cup in 1994. At that time, football was still a marginal sport in a country dominated by American football, baseball, and basketball. FIFA's objective was not simply to stage a tournament, but to expand the global game into its largest untapped market. On that front, there was change. The tournament drew large attendances and helped create momentum for the launch of Major League Soccer 2 years later. Over time, football became significantly more embedded in the US sporting landscape. But this is where a distinction becomes important. The shift was cultural and sporting, not primarily economic. Because the United States already possessed the stadiums, transport systems, and financial infrastructure required to host the tournament, and because of that, there was no need for large-scale construction or urban redevelopment. That limited costs, but also limited the scope for transformative economic impact. Tourism rose temporarily, but there is little evidence of a lasting macroeconomic shift. Mexico's experience in 1986 offers a different variation of the same pattern. After Colombia withdrew as a host, Mexico stepped in at short notice. The country relied heavily on existing infrastructure and avoided major capital expenditure. The tournament was a sporting success and remains culturally significant. It enhanced Mexico's international profile during a period of economic difficulty. But again, the longer-term economic effects are difficult to separate from broader structural changes that were already underway. Taken together, North America's previous World Cups points to a consistent pattern. The most durable effects tend to be indirect: visibility, branding, cultural influence, and in some cases shifts in participation or consumption. The idea of deep structural economic transformation is far harder to sustain. This is reflected in the wider research literature, which is far more divided than public debate often suggests. Some studies identify gains in tourism, temporary employment, infrastructure delivery, and international reputation. Others highlight cost overruns, underused infrastructure, environmental pressure, rising house costs, and the diversion of public resources away from more persistent needs. The key point is not that one side is right and the other is wrong. It is that outcomes vary significantly depending on context. Sporting mega events do not operate as a single economic mechanism. They interact with pre-existing conditions. This is why organizations such as the World Economic Forum describe them as catalysts. A catalyst does not generate change on its own. It accelerates processes that are already in motion. If a country has a coherent development strategy, strong institutions and planned investment pipelines, a World Cup can reinforce and accelerate those trajectories. If those conditions are absent, the event is unlikely to generate lasting transformation. That brings us to something that is often missing from the economic literature: how these events are politically constructed in the first place. When London bid for the 2012 Olympics, the argument was not primarily about sport or short-term economic gain. It was about legacy. I recall working in Parliament during that period, when the bid was being discussed and defended to MPs. The case being made by ministers and officials was not that the Games would be entertaining or even profitable in the narrow sense. It was that they would regenerate East London, attract investment, improve infrastructure, create jobs, and deliver long-term social and economic benefits. Legacy was not a slogan, it was the central justification. That framing has since become standard practice. Mega events are now routinely presented as long-term development strategies rather than short-term sporting spectacles. But that shift has consequences, because once legacy becomes the organizing principle, the burden of expectation expands dramatically. The success of a World Cup or Olympic Games is no longer judged by whether it is well organized or widely watched. It is judged by whether it delivers structural transformation across housing, transport, employment, investment, and international standing. That is a far higher bar than most public events are designed to meet. And it helps explain why debates over impact are so persistent. Supporters point to visible infrastructure, increased tourism, and international exposure. Critics ask whether those outcomes would have occurred anyway, whether public money could have been deployed more effectively, and whether benefits were distributed in the way promised. The argument is no longer about whether the event worked, it is about whether the story told about the event was ever realistic. And that brings us back to 2026. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have all justified hosting the World Cup in terms of opportunity, investment, and legacy. Yet the evidence from previous tournaments suggests something more restrained. Barcelona shows what is possible when a mega event is embedded within a wider transformation strategy. North America's previous World Cups show more modest and uneven effects. The academic literature shows no reliable economic formula for transformation. The consistent pattern is simpler. Mega events do not create new national trajectories. They simply amplify existing ones. They accelerate what is already underway. They make visible what is already there. And that is why the most important question about 2026 is not whether it will be successful as a tournament. It almost certainly will be. The question is what it reveals once the tournament ends. Because when the final whistle blows, when the stadium's empty and the broadcast cameras move on, the underlying conditions remain. Countries do not get the World Cup they imagine in their bid documents. They get the World Cup their institutions, infrastructure, and political choices allow them to sustain. And that is all for this episode of 10 Minutes On. So thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you again next week. Goodbye.